Hi, welcome to class today. I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State, and the class is Ethics and Values. We're now into our business ethics section, and today we're going to be discussing Karl Marx with Pierre Lamarche. Thanks so much for coming today, Dr. Lamarche.
Thank you, Elaine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, glad to have you here, and I'd like to introduce you to our students who are with us. Over here we have Luke and Rhonda, and here John and Aaron. Thanks so much for being with us today. I think that you're going to find that Pierre has an exceptional background in Karl Marx. And Pierre, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I did my undergraduate work at the University of Toronto, lo these many years ago, where once upon a time I was a physics student. And I was lured to the study of philosophy by a professor at the University of Toronto, Rebecca Comey, who introduced me to a particular flavor of Marxist theory called critical theory. And it was through taking classes with her that I was sort of nudged in the area of philosophy, and I switched my major, and then I went and did graduate work at the University of Texas at Austin. There I studied under the tutelage of one of the foremost representatives in the English-speaking world of critical theory, Douglas Kellner, who is now at UCLA. But while I was there, I also had the pleasure of taking classes from a fellow by the name of Harry Cleaver in the economics department, who introduced me to kind of Marxist theory that I really latched onto and took hold of, and it's generally referred to as autonomist Marxism. So that's my background, my philosophical background vis-a-vis Marx at least.
Wow, that's going to be so interesting to have this discussion with you today. I was visiting with Rhonda before class started, and she's read up on some background on Marx. So Rhonda, do you mind telling us a little bit about Karl Marx and some of his background?
I find him to be kind of an interesting fellow. He was born in 1818 in Germany. He was born into a Jewish family, but during that period of time, his father was not allowed to practice law because of his Jewish status. And so his father converted to Christianity in the Lutheran part of Christianity. He went on to college. Marx did, and his father wasn't really. His father didn't like the fact that he was not practicing law the way, or taking law classes the way that he would want him to, and so. He felt that he needed to transfer him to another college, and that didn't do a whole lot of good still, and he ended up going into philosophy. Because of his going into philosophy, he went from a number of different countries, starting in Germany, he went to Paris. Paris kicked him out for some reason or another, so he went to England. England kicked him out, and he went back to Paris, met Friedrich Engels. They got kicked out of Paris again, went to Brussels, and it was kind of this round and round sort of thing.
But they did some marvelous writing together, didn't they?
The Communist Manifesto was written by Marx and Engels, and he was only 30 years old.
It's an amazing thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's cute is I said to Pierre, you've got your tie tucked in your shirt, and he said, oh no, this is part of the proletariat scholar. So tell us a little bit about how your look today fits in with the proletariat scholar and your notions of Marxism.
Well, as I told you, Elaine, I'm not a factory worker, but I am a worker. I labor for a wage. And so I decided that today, discussing Marx, I would put on a uniform, as it were, that sort of reflected the fact that I was a proletariat, a worker, somebody who worked for a wage, but did so in an office behind a computer. Once upon a time, in the era of the first days during which people worked for a wage, not in a factory or on a farm, but in an office, clerks, for example, or draftspersons, they were in an office, so they were expected to wear a shirt and a tie, but they were scrivening, copying text, or doing draft work, so they couldn't have their cuffs mucking up the ink, or their tie mucking up the ink. So this is the proletarian intellectual laborer look, the rolled up sleeve shirts and the tie tucked in.
I like it, and you can see that, John didn't bother with the tie for today, and look over here, we'll have to get the sleeves rolled up.
Next session, yes, we're going to have to roll up the sleeves over here. I'm sorry, Luke.
All right. tell us a little bit more about Karl Marx. I think Rhonda's given us some excellent information, but tell us a little bit about Marx and his importance in business ethics as studying him as we're studying Adam Smith and other scholars.
Well, Marx is important for many different areas of what we refer to as theory in general. We were mentioning a little bit earlier the fact that there's a difference between Marx, the individual, who he was, the texts that he wrote himself and that he wrote in conjunction with Engels, and Marxisms or Marxist theories. Marxism or Marxist theory is a theory in any area of scholarship, particularly in the humanities, philosophy, for example, ethics, business ethics, or economics, or politics, political theory, sociology, anthropology, history, any sort of theory, the basis of which is informed by the original work of Marx and Engels. So I think that Marx and Engels' work does have a lot to offer and to inform into philosophy in general and ethics, and certainly particularly in the area of business ethics.
And I'm so impressed that one of your true mentors came from economics. So
yes, he's one of the last of a dying breed of economists whose work is truly grounded in and based in the work of Karl Marx. Not too many of those people around left.
From time to time, I'll have students who want to object to reading the Communist Manifesto. They feel like somehow they're going to be converted to a horrible way of life or something. But it's almost like if it didn't say the Communist Manifesto on it, they just say, well, it's kind of a sensible document. What do you think about this reading for today, John?
I think it's very sensible. I think last time we talked about Adam Smith, and we kind of talked about how he was pointing out some of the benefits of capitalism, and Karl Marx comes in and he starts pointing out some of the negative effects of capitalism, and I think it's very important, and it is very sensible and accessible and readable.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to tell us about their comfort level with the reading for today? Luke?
I found it very interesting reading this, just because, you know, as I was reading it, I was thinking these are the exact same arguments I hear now with regards to the effects of globalization. You know, it's as if he wrote it last week. It's amazing that it's still, you know, it's still very applicable today. He's excellent at, like John was saying, pointing out what the underside, the downside of capitalism is.
You know, I had the very same thoughts as I was reviewing this as well, so that it could have just almost been written last week.
Yeah.
And it stays very current and becomes part of a living text in many classrooms.
Well, there are many of us who believe that Marx's work is still very relevant in today's contemporary situation of globalization, etc. But I think with Marx, and in particular with a document like the Communist Manifesto, it's very helpful and informative to take into consideration the historical context within which the document was written.
Oh, I do too. And will you help us with that?
Absolutely, Elaine. The document was written in 1848 by Marx and Engels, and it was written at the request of an international association of workers, which came to be known as the Communist League.
The Communist League. Now, Aaron, if you heard a term like this, the Communist League, and you've never heard it before, you've never heard the word communism or communist, what would you think it would mean?
Well, I'd start asking myself, what are they communing with? And obviously they're communing with each other. They're sharing a common purpose maybe, or a goal. I think today we take for granted the notion of a labor union, but it sure sounds like it's the beginnings of something like that.
Sure, and we have a whole branch of philosophy called communitarianism, so meaning that people join together for a common cause. So basically, these are workers uniting.
Exactly, and Aaron is exactly correct. It really is the first international workers' union, which was assembling in the 1840s. They had to do so in secret because unions of this kind, and in particular international associations of workers or unions, were illegal in almost every jurisdiction in Europe during this time period. So this is an international association of workers who met in secret in London in 1847, and they requested that Marx and Engels produce a document that would be their manifesto, their leitmotif, their document that would indicate what precisely were the goals that they had come together in this association and were working towards. And it's also important to note that this time period was one of tremendous crisis. And
It
Marx
was,
and
wasn't it?
Engels make
Yeah.
reference to the contemporary crisis in the manifesto. 1846, 1847, there was tremendous economic and actually agricultural turmoil that took place throughout much of Europe. There was famine, massive layoff of workers, and this led to a situation where in 1848, the actual year that the document was produced, there were revolutions that took place in the streets of major cities throughout Europe. So this is the historical context, the very beginning of a nascent union movement that was organizing in secret because it was illegal, and the goal in the first instance was to try to begin to gain a certain amount of political power for ordinary working class people who had no political power whatsoever during this time period.
How very interesting. John, do you have any comments, any questions, or Aaron?
I think that the concept of a labor union sometimes has a negative connotation, but I think it's important to note that a lot of the conditions that we're working in now are the result of labor unions and the work they've done, and it's not necessarily, it shouldn't have the negative connotation that it does, especially in this context.
And there was a lot of violence. There's always violence, though, when we're talking about changes dealing with money and massive major changes dealing with an economic structure. Aaron?
I just think it's interesting that, as Pierre pointed out, that the agricultural upheaval led a lot of these people who had been rural and subsistence kind of farmers, and they ended up in the cities and became this urban working class poor. That needed to unionize, that needed to find a way to have a voice, because they suddenly were in a brand new situation.
And that's definitely coming out in this reading, isn't it? Rhonda or Luke, any other thoughts on this?
Well, you know, I do have an interesting, in reference to Engels. You know, Engels, when he met Marx, had indicated to him that he was a committed communist. And although, you know, it was Engels' family who, the increasing steady income that family had in Manchester, England, which was what kept both Marx and Engels afloat. And yet, you know, communism means that classless, stateless social organization, you know, that they were wanting to put into being. You know, just kind of an interesting insight there.
Somehow you've got to live.
Indeed, indeed. And this, of course, is a time period during, well, a couple of other things about the historical context. Of course, the first few decades of the 19th century. This is the last period of good old laissez-faire capitalism. No government interference in economic policies back then. And of course, this translates for ordinary working class people to you get paid whatever the boss decides to pay you. You work as long as the boss decides you're going to work.
No benefits.
No benefits of any kind. Children working in factories. No labor laws and no laws regulating labor practices whatsoever.
And this is also very fundamental then in seeing some of those changes. Well, should we go ahead and move on with the reading then? Sure. And one of the first areas that we talk about here are some definitions. And Pierre, do you mind reading the first two definitions and telling us a little bit about the bosses, the entrepreneurs? Okay, go ahead.
Well, our first definition is bourgeois, and bourgeois is a French term that actually just means townsperson, somebody who lives in a town. And it's a term that Marx and Engels picked up on because during feudal time period, the Middle Ages, the first people who began to work in the industrial sector, in manufacturing or in commerce or in business, were the townsfolk, the bourgeois. And so bourgeois is a term that refers to people who make a living off of industry or commerce or trade, something of this nature. So for us, it might be equivalent to the term capitalist. Somebody
Okay.
who has capital and money and invests it in a firm, a manufacturing interest or a commercial interest or something like that.
Okay, and the second term for us then.
Bourgeoisie, again, the bourgeoisie is a term that they make use of in order to reflect, as the heading indicates, capitalist society.
Pierre is a French speaker, a fluent French
doubt.
speaker, and it was so nice to have him read the first two. But let's have John read the last three for us. And John, tell us just a little bit about these three as well.
All right. Capital is the ownership of some good. Despotism is used to refer to tyrannical power. And the proletariat, or the lower class wage earner that does not possess capital.
Okay, what would you like to add to your definitions there?
Well, capital, when it's referring to the ownership of some good, it goes beyond just physical possessions. It also is used to denote wealth in some way, or the accumulation of wealth. And I think the other ones are pretty self-explanatory.
Okay, thank you. And we can take ourselves back to the 1800s when this is written, or we can keep ourselves right in today's business climate as we're going through this. And let's go ahead and look at the next graphic. And Luke, would you read that for us?
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
So have you got that one memorized, Luke? Why is it such an important statement?
I think it's an important statement because in many respects it's true. I mean, there are arguments to say that religion or culture is another factor, an equal factor, a greater factor in conflict. But I think that economics and class struggle is generally an element in any struggle, historically speaking.
Okay, and we see this in numerous writings. We'll still see it in writings in philosophy, history, literature. It shows up in many, many places, still saying we're looking at class struggles. It doesn't seem to leave us, does it, Dr. LaMarche?
Yes, well, it's actually an interesting way and a novel way for the time period, the middle 1800s, of examining what the substance of history really is all about. You can look at classical antiquity, the great Greek and Roman cultures, and you can define that period of history according to the great works, the great pieces of architecture, the great achievements in engineering, or the battles that they fought, etc. Or you can say really what was at the basis of that culture and that society, struggle between slaves and free people, citizens. Or during the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, you can examine once again the various contours of those societies according to their various achievements, cultural achievements, achievements in art and literature and constructing grand cathedrals, etc. Or you can say what the substance of history during that time period was about was the relationship between an oppressed class of people, peasants, serfs, and the feudal aristocracy.
And we see a lot of this also in this reading by Marx then, as we're looking at the Communist Manifesto.
Marx looks at the modern age and says, well, we've got all kinds of things going on, developments in science and engineering and technology and manufacturing that are all great and wonderful on his view. But really the substance, as he sees it, of history during this time period is a struggle between people who own capital, who own wealth, and who own property, and who own factories, etc., and people who own nothing other than their labor power.
Mm-hmm. Well, then let's pull into the next graphic and see how he's going to give advice on this labor power and also give some warnings. And would you read this for us then, Erin?
Sure. Bourgeois society replaces old class struggles with new ones. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonism. It has only established new classes, new conditions of oppression, and new forms of struggle in place of the old ones.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Erin?
Well, I think what he's saying is that when you have to dig a little bit deeper, because what happens is over time as history does change, or as societies change, we come up with new ways to oppress a lower class, or we come up with new ways to have power, and that that just because it's a new way doesn't mean it's a new struggle. And he's pointing out, as Pierre pointed out, that you always have the plebeian and the senator. You always have the serf and the aristocracy, or the prince. You always have the worker and the person who employs them.
Okay. And Luke, how about it? You've probably seen some of this in your study of Italy.
Yeah, well, I was thinking that if you think about the Industrial Revolution, and as Bonarici was talking about last time, it goes through different phases. And in the beginning, you're replacing people who are craftsmen, and you're replacing them with factories. And you see one way of life kind of disappearing and being replaced with another. You can see that today as well. You can see that, here in the United States, steel workers are becoming unemployed. Those jobs are being transferred elsewhere, and they're being replaced with other technologies and other industries. And it is always kind of this struggle of destruction and creation of new industry.
Okay, anyone else want to add to this? Very good. Good insights on that. Anything you'd like to add to that, Pierre?
Yeah, I think it's important to note at this point that neither Marx nor Engels had any nostalgia for something like a better or simpler or easier way of life that was disappearing, the happy peasants or serfs in the fields, and the benign, noble...
Everyone was always unhappy.
And so they actually do applaud many of the achievements of capitalism, chiefly for doing away with the oppressive class structure of feudalism, which they believe was a good thing, and they believe that the rise of capital and capitalism was responsible for that. And the rise of capitalism, on their view, also unleashed what they refer to in numerous points as the tremendous, tremendous power of socialized labor.
Okay, thank you. And I should also mention that one of my mentors in my doctoral program, Jim Anderson, was very good in as a Marxist scholar and in doing critical theory. And we look at this very important shift that Marx is trying to bring about in the minds of the workers, saying, wait a minute, it doesn't always have to be like this. You don't always just have to be living from hand to mouth. We can have a much more egalitarian society. We can have much better conditions. We're all equal, we're all humans. And so let's move on to our next graphic that helps us see a little bit more where he's going to define this. And could you read that for us, John?
Yes. Two classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Our epic, the epic of the bourgeoisie, shows, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat.
And do you think it helps out, John, to give a definition to it, to say, this is where you fit in, and these are the things that are happening in your life? Have you ever had those aha moments where you've said, oh, wow, I fit into this definition?
Yeah, and I think that a definition is really simple at this point, because the bourgeoisie are those who have capital and are able to use it, and the proletariat is not. And the bourgeoisie is a bourgeoisie by virtue of having capital, and that's it. And for the most part.
And so to use a colloquialism, they're in the driver's seat. So how is Marx going to help us through this then, Pierre?
Well, these concepts are a little bit more difficult to sort of discern in today's world. It's a little bit more difficult to discern who the capitalist class are or is, who those individuals are. The other class, the proletariat, I think it's still very easy to understand what who those groups of people are. They're people like us in this room, people who once again do not really have any resources other than our own labor power, and we feed ourselves, and we put a roof over our heads, and we feed our children by selling our labor for a wage. So that category, or that class of individuals, is still something that I think we can recognize in today's world very much so. The other class is sort of really not really a group of individuals anymore, as a group of institutions, large corporations, etc.
Very interesting and clear concept, I think, for us. Any questions or comments you'd like to make on these two distinctions, and the proletariat and the bourgeois? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on, and thanks so much for that, Pierre. Rhonda, could you read this next one for us, please?
Sure. It's the rapid capital development. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development.
And we can see that's what's happening as he and Engels are putting together this piece, and maybe it could even be compared with China or some other Asian markets that we might be seeing today. What do you think about that?
Well, in the historical context, he's really referring to, once again, the basic economic transition between feudalism and the modern industrial age. Even in the 1700s, in most countries in Europe, the way that you generated wealth and the people who were wealthy was defined by the people who owned land and collected rents from their tenants, the old feudal aristocracy. By the first few decades of the 1800s, with the Industrial Revolution and rapid industrialization and commercialization, the way that wealth is generated in that world, just as it is today, is to be involved in industry and commerce. And that was the force that was pushing the economic engine to greater and greater extents. And the individuals who were generating tremendous amounts of wealth by the early 1800s were no longer the aristocracy sitting on their land and collecting rent, but rather captains of industry and people involved in commerce and business.
Oh, so very interesting. When my late husband Kirk and I went to China in 1986, we saw a lot of banners in cities like Beijing and Shanghai that said modernization by the year 2000. And what modernization actually meant was a lot of rapid industrialization, a lot of moving toward a Western society of capitalism. And you can see today that the markets are very strong, the capitalistic markets are very strong in China. Workers are still paid quite low, and they'll probably go through some of these very same class struggles that other countries have been through.
And again, of course, Marx and Engels pointed out that there is a significant positive aspect to industrialization and urbanization back then, as it is in China in the last 20 or 30 years. It's the way to generate wealth, the wealth that provides goods and services for everyone.
In fact, it wasn't Marx very supportive of the Union of America during the Civil War. He understood what was happening around the world. And, he was also a journalist and wrote articles in the New York Times, I think it was.
Truly was a world traveler, sometimes against his will.
Indeed.
And did, I think, understand these global markets and
very much
global
so.
struggles.
Very much recognized the fact that this was the way that Western and then global economies were going to go. Greater and greater international commerce, because once again, the more commerce with the greatest number of people that you're engaged in, the more wealth that you generate.
And isn't this where Marx is so misunderstood?
There are a number of ways in which Marx is misunderstood. Yes, I think this is definitely one of them, yes.
Okay, do you want to clarify that a little more, Rhonda?
Well, I was thinking of Marxist with Lenin, or Marxism with Mayo. Those are very different communism or Marxisms than what Marx really was all about.
Very, very much so, yes. When Marx and Engels are trying to conceive of sort of revolutionary struggles that are going to change the social, economic, political fabric of a nation, They envisioned a revolutionary transformation taking place in the most highly sophisticated and highly industrialized and the most democratic nations in the world. In the 1800s and early 1900s, this would be England, certainly, and then the United States. When a revolution took place that was controlled by people who considered themselves to be Marxists, it didn't happen in the most industrialized nations on the planet, the most advanced nations. It happened in a couple of the most backward, a couple of nations that were still in a feudal situation. And so different historical situations call for different strategies, something that Marx teaches us. And people like Lenin and Mao decided that, well, we're gonna leave the textbook here and we're gonna develop our own strategies for the historical situation that we're in. And strategy number one in both of those situations was industrialize and modernize, even if it means engaging in oppressing your own people.
All right, and something that then we'll see Marx would be very opposed to. Let's look at the next graphic, and Luke, would you go over this for us, please?
The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communications, draws all, even the most backward nations, into civilization. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world in its own image.
I really love where the discussion's been going on this, and it seems like that Pierre is anticipating the points just as we're ready to bring up the next one. But Luke, do you want to tell us about this a little bit?
I think that this was kind of what I had in mind at the beginning when I was talking about how this made me think of current arguments about globalization, is that there are so many, one of the trends of globalization, I guess capitalism is, in general, is that we become very much alike. I've spoken about Italy and how it's a little different. But now you go to Italy and they're starting to have, big Walmart type stores, and it's becoming very much like America. And you go anywhere and it's becoming very much like America. And, some people aren't happy about that their culture is kind of being swallowed up and being very much like everybody else's.
And a tough thing in some of these countries where they're very uncomfortable with it. I spend time in Finland, and I do some business ethics courses there for the Helsinki School of Economics, and they are very resistant to big global chains coming in and starting business in any area of Finland. They're trying very much to sustain their own economy. John, any comments on where the discussion's been going?
I also think it's interesting to note that if you look at the United States and kind of the history of conflict in the United States, usually the United States is in conflict with people that have some kind of different economic strategies than they do. And we usually get along with the people that have similar economic strategies. And this would kind of go along with this point that we're in conflict because it's almost like we're trying to change them. We're trying to get them to conform to our economy and so on.
Okay, Dr. LaMarche, good point made. And any comments you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, very good points made. Well, the general point that he's making, and I think it's once again very relevant for the time period in the mid-1800s and still very relevant today, is that if your interest is in making money, then your interest is in turning the entire world into wage laborers and consumers of goods. And that's the program.
And that's the program, and our next graphic also shows that as well. Aaron, would you do this for us, please?
Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer, who is no longer able to control the powers of the subterranean world which he has called up by his spells.
Okay, what a lovely image he gives us here. Pierre, what warning is he giving us?
Oh, this is great stuff. I love this sort of stuff because there is a significant message in the imagery that he's using, the image of sorcery here. And one of the things that he's pointing out here is that these sorts of processes, in a way, they're kind of magical. Because, and there's a bit of a relationship to Adam Smith and his invisible hand. He's not suggesting that what is going on is being conjured up in the minds of individual evil capitalists and factory owners who have gotten together as a cabal and decided that this is the world that we're going to create. And this is precisely how we are going to oppress these people. This is not a moral critique of individuals. This is a social critique of society as a whole.
Oh, I'm glad you made that clarification. And that's such an important point for the test, too.
Although Marx is given a funny kind of, it's Marx. Marx is the one who calls capitalism evil, and it wasn't him.
Right. This is true.
And John?
Isn't there an extent to which the powerful language he's using here is kind of like a rallying cry to the troops almost? It's like the people would agree with me. It's almost like a rallying cry. And isn't that one of the reasons he might be misunderstood, because of the powerful language?
Very much so, and particularly this text, once again, when we consider the historical context, this is a time period during which ordinary working class people have no political power whatsoever. The people who are in positions of political power are those who have wealth, and these are the bourgeois or the capitalist class of individuals, and they have created a situation, for example, within which there are no labor laws. Why are there no labor laws? Because
why would we want
the
them?
people who own the factories have political power. And it's a bad situation.
We could be bankrupt if we have labor laws, if we give benefits, if we raise the minimum wage. Oh, wait, there's no minimum wage.
So John's exactly right. Things are looking very grim for working class people in 1847 and 1848. It looks like things might be hopeless. And again, this is exactly one of the things that's going on here. Marx and Engels are sort of trying to rally the troops and say, hey guys, get together, organize, and you can seize political power and work together in order to change and alter positively the material conditions of your life, the conditions under which you work and under which you live. So go to it.
And it is beautiful writing, as you mentioned. Rhonda, would you continue on with the quote and the thought that we have going here?
As market grows, laborers increase in proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed. In the same proportion as the proletariat. Proletariat, I'm sorry, I didn't see that T. The modern working class developed a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market.
Okay, so a warning that they're not protected well, are they, Rhonda?
No, not at that period of time. Not only was there not any political clout, there were no rights. There was no privilege other than being a laborer.
You're just going to kind of be thrown around like leaves in the wind, so to speak.
But also, again, in this graphic, we see more rallying of the troops. Marx and Engels are pointing out the fact that as capital expands and grows, it can only expand and grow by workers, increasing the number of workers, increasing the number of people who can organize, get together, and struggle in order to, again, ameliorate and change positively their working conditions and the general conditions under which they live their lives. So as capital gets bigger and stronger, so does the proletariat at the same time.
And, and I think it might be a little bit of an important item to remember is that the Industrial Revolution was just that, industrial. It was hard work.
Indeed.
Very much so. And punishing work as they went through it. John?
Another idea here that I really like is, Marx is pointing out that the worker becomes a commodity, which is something that I'm not sure Adam Smith, writing before him, really got into, is that the worker would become a commodity, and when they become a commodity, they're treated in a very cold way. They're just part of the equation in making profit.
And it wasn't really part of Smith's enterprise either. This was, Smith had a very different philosophy from which he was making his points, and we see then Marx countering some of these. Aaron, let's have you go ahead and do the next reading. Excellent discussion. And would you read the graphic and tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine.
Okay, how about making a lot of pins every day?
Well, I mean, he's using, and I think it's interesting and critical to point out that he's adopting Adam Smith's own terms here, division of labor, and kind of this idea of the machine, the division becoming not just something that helps the worker but hinders them as well. Smith, in all of his brilliance, didn't ever, I think, foresee, at least in my reading of him, doesn't seem to foresee the mass that capitalism can take on and consume, including people. And I think what Marx is pointing out here is that not only does it consume like we said, the things, the products, and in turn turn everything into the commodity in objects, but then the people become objects as well.
Okay. And he uses this term charm, and the worker is no longer charmed by maybe making a desk and selling it and saying, look at this beautiful desk I've made. Rather, they're appendage of a machine that made the desk. You want to tell us a little bit about how he's giving them a little comfort as well as cheer?
Yeah, I want to pick up actually on one of the points that Aaron was just making, vis-a-vis Adam Smith, and then we'll get a little bit to that. Another thing that's going on in this passage here, and this is what you're trying to get at, I think, is the notion that the economy, what we refer to as the economy, is not some abstract entity that can be described with pie charts and graphs and numbers, and that's all that it is. The economy is what?
People doing
People. People. It's a social relationship among people. It's people doing work. It's not, again, this abstract thing that is reducible to charts and numbers. And of course, the other point that he's making is that, well, work sucks. Whether you're in a factory in Manchester in the 1840s, that's a kind of labor that really was terrible. Yeah. Or whether it's the year 2000 whatever, and you're sitting in a cubicle with some sort of device in your ear and you're telemarketing or something like that, or sitting in front of a computer doing data entry. It's just not really fun. Most people would rather be doing other things with their time than data entry, working in a factory. Most of us would rather be spending more time with our family, our friends, doing activities that are of interest and meaning and significance to us.
A wonderful, wonderful take on that. And we can see that we're pretty lucky to have our jobs,
You
aren't
and
we?
I are extremely, extremely lucky,
Because I
and
feel
we
like
must never forget that.
I truly feel charmed by my job. I have day-to-day happiness with it.
And we have to remember, too, that
as professors, we
very few people are as lucky as we are.
Yeah, we are truly charmed to have that. Well, let's go ahead and pull up the next graphic, and all of you stay in school, get jobs you really like. And Rhonda, would you read this for us, please?
Sure. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeoisie class and of the bourgeoisie or the bourgeois state, I mispronounced that, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the foreman, and above all by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself.
Thank you. We could have had Pierre read that as the native French
been
speaker,
so
but
nice.
you did very, very well with it. Tell us how this adds then to his argument.
Well, again, it's continuing the points that we've been making for the last few minutes, describing really the conditions of labor under capitalism. And again, once again, it's very helpful to keep in mind the historical situation of the time period. Again, there are no labor laws, and there are a series of crises in the early 1800s where wages are fluctuating wildly and prices are fluctuating wildly, and people find themselves in a position where the material conditions of their lives are actually worsening. Even though they have a job and they're working hard, they're getting worse. They're not getting ahead, they're falling behind.
Oh, and let's go ahead and pull up the next graphic because it also supports this as well. John, would you read this for us?
Yes. Bourgeoisie harms laborer, society, and itself. But modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and a pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth.
So, John, tell us a little about this then.
Well, I think it goes along with the point we were just making that, especially in this time period, the worker is sinking deeper and deeper into a truly horrible situation as far as his work and his labor is concerned.
Okay.
His or her.
All right, so building once again a strong argument and a very clear, concise argument. And Erin, do you want to read the next graphic for us and we'll discuss it?
Bourgeoisie unfit to rule, and here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society.
Thank you. And I'd like to move on to the next graphic, which is our concluding graphic, and have Pierre help us wrap up these very important statements. But would you read this for us with force, Luke?
Okay. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable.
Okay, so Pierre, tell us about these two concluding statements and why they are so fundamental to Marx's theory.
Well, again, crucial to consider the time period. Tremendous crises are taking place in most European nations, 1846, 47, 48. Again, revolutions in the streets, people rioting in the tens of thousands throughout much of Europe. And this despite the fact that the capitalist wealthy classes had been in political control, really for the most part, in these European nations for a number of decades. This political power that they were wielding was unable to prevent the crises that were occurring. And again, part of what's going on here is rallying the troops and saying, these people can't run the show. We've been creating more and more and more wealth, social wealth, for decades now, and yet we're in a situation in which we seem to be going backwards. And people in the wealthiest cities in Europe are suffering from famine. So it's time for a change. So this is one of the messages.
And you know, when he talks about the bourgeois producing their own grave diggers, when he talks about the state that they're now in, I kind of see human beings reduced to machines, as he's talking about, machines that are broken and can just be thrown out, and we'll find another crop of machines to bring in and do this same work. And he says, you are the grave diggers, you know, the bourgeois.
Recognize the power that you have collectively in organizing yourselves and engaging in struggle in order to improve the conditions of your lives. And I think that's certainly a message that is very relevant today. In the wealthiest nation on earth, a nation that creates the sort of wealth that Marx and Engels couldn't even imagine in living in what was then the wealthiest nation on earth, England, and yet we're in a situation in which tens of millions of people do not have health insurance. Tens of millions of people are living paycheck to paycheck, worrying about how they're going to pay the rent or pay the mortgage at the end of the month. And once again, the wealthiest nation that has ever existed.
Well, you know, I'd like to bring this up to the modern day, and I've got a video clip. I'd like us to watch the video clip and then see how these comments that we've gone over from the Marx article tie into the modern day worker. So let's go ahead and show that clip.
Jan Parks graduated with a degree in marketing 3 years ago. She is currently selling advertising space for the Metro News. As the head salesperson, Jan has discretion about which ads to accept and can turn down those she finds inappropriate. Jan has been married for 2 years, and today, as she often does, is having lunch with her husband in a local park.
Ever wish you'd win the lottery so you wouldn't have to deal with something?
Deal with what? Having to go to work every morning? Sure.
No. I don't mean anything that drastic.
What's wrong? Editorials affecting sales again?
No, sales are fine. In fact, that's the problem. I've got a prospect that I really don't want to deal with. It's that furrier over on Chestnut.
Jeez, not that again.
Bruce, you know how much the fur industry bothers me.
Oh, you can't be serious. It's one thing to do volunteer work for the Humane Society, but letting this mess with your work?
I'm not going to forget my concern for animals just because of my job. Look, I don't want to fight over this. This is very difficult for me. So, please, can we discuss it?
I'm sorry. Okay. First, when did this come up?
This morning. And I think they want to buy a lot of space. It'd be for fall, right through Christmas.
Big sale. You haven't turned them down already, have you?
No.
Good.
That's why we're talking about it.
Good. And Jim, try to remove yourself from this for a moment. You know, I can't believe, given the money this sale could bring to us, that this is even a problem for you.
I can't remove myself. Just think about those poor animals.
But that was what they were raised for. And I don't think that's the issue. I do think the money is important. We have jobs to make money. We happen to need the money. Are you forgetting about our mortgage payment? And when we took that house, we both knew how much it would strap us.
This wouldn't affect my salary.
Well, not your base, but since when are you not paid commissions? Huh? Sweetheart, you're cutting away part of our income no matter how you look at it.
I know. And that's why I wanted to talk to you about it. But to me, this goes beyond money. The fur industry sickens me. And I just don't want to help them sell their product.
Sweetheart, I'm sorry, but I don't think you're looking at this objectively at all. And if you reject this ad, I'm sure another paper will take it. You'll end up enriching your competition, hurting us and the paper financially. And what will you have accomplished? If you want to know the truth, what really bugs me is there's no consistency to the way you look at this.
What do you mean?
If you're so concerned about animals, I mean, why do you eat meat? I mean, you're eating a hot dog, for God's sake. And pigs, cattle, they're raised to be slaughtered. And what about your shoes? They're made of leather. Do you really need to wear leather running shoes?
Well, there's a big difference between things that are truly useful and things that are just a vulgar display, like fur.
Fine. Even though leather and meat aren't necessities, I'll accept your point. But realize what we're talking about here are compromises.
Can't you see? You're asking me to give in on something that's very important to me. Talk about selling out.
Yeah, I know it isn't an easy decision, and I appreciate you talking to me about it. Are you really going to reject everything that personally offends you? I mean, considering the implications of your decision, I really think you need to consider about where you can draw the line.
Very interesting case study. And as we look at the case studies, we try to say, first of all, what are the ethical considerations? We try to say, who are the stakeholders? Who are the people who are involved in this? And then also, what might be a resolve for it? And Pierre, as we look at what are the ethical considerations, then we would be considering how would Marx see this case? How would he help the young woman through this case?
Well, I think Marx might advise both of these young people to get out of the world of business and go run a cranberry bog or something. But I think the more general point that we can take from Marx and Marxist theory when we're examining a dilemma like this is the following. If we really took a hard look at the way that wealth is generated in our society, either businesses that we ourselves are operating in or businesses that we're supporting by buying their products, if you saw how the wealth was created and generated, you might object to it, because you might find that the wealth is created by what some people consider to be the unnecessary torture of animals, or the wealth is being generated by children in Pakistan sewing soccer balls or something like that. So I think that's the general message that Marx would want to take. Whatever business you're in, whatever business you're supporting, personally yourself or through your dollars spending in a store, look at how that wealth is being generated and how that business is functioning. Are they killing animals for no reason whatsoever? Or are they exploiting their workers, for example?
Thank you. And as the students write their papers, their case studies for this class, they need to use a philosopher for at least one page in making an argument about the case that they're exploring. And I think that your discussion on how Marx would fit in very well with this case helps us out a lot. That it doesn't have to be this particular case, but anything that shows maybe that there could be harm, unnecessary harm, or...
Well, again, business in general is not an abstract entity. It's a social relationship among human beings, and this is probably the main point that Marx would want to point out.
Oh, and that's a perfect way for us to end class today. Thank you so much for joining us, Pierre. This has been an outstanding discussion. You're a brilliant scholar.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Elaine, and to the students as well. It's been wonderful.
Yes, thank you to you, students. And next time we're going to move on into Milton Friedman. So we're moving from one strong philosopher to another who's going to take a completely different economic position. So enjoy your readings. Bye-bye.